Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians. The Russians managed to advance in the Vovchansk direction in the northern bank of the Vovcha river line, northeast of the Tigre. The Russians continued offensive operations within the Serebriansky forest area, breaking through the Ukrainian lines and operationally encircling the entire Ukrainian grouping within the Serebriansky forest area. The Russians also managed to advance to the northeast of Pokrovsk and the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, the Russians made a small advance on the northern bank of the Vovcha river line, advancing along the forest patch area, clearing them of Ukrainian soldiers as they advanced in the eastern direction alongside the river line itself, expanding their zone of control along the border area. Russians are here looking to expand to the southern bank of the Vovcha river line and gain full control over Vovcha as a logistical hub for future offensive operations in the southeastern and southwestern directions. The expansion in the eastern direction allows them to create additional crossings across the Vovcha river line for future offensive operations to establish themselves and secure a foothold on the southern bank of the river line. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians made a significant advance within the Serebriansky forest area, gaining control over several fortified positions and advancing to the very rear of the fortified positions centered around the Serebriansky forest area. We see the entire grouping of Ukrainian forces along these fortified positions are now operationally encircled, with the Russians present on the southern and northern flanks and full control over the eastern flank. With this, the Russians are able to fire at any Ukrainian forces withdrawing from, arriving to, or supplying the Ukrainian forces within this pocket. With this, the Russian operation to gain full control over the Serebriansky forest area has begun. This is combined with the recent advances by the Russians along the Torsk direction along the Serebets river line. The Russians are looking here to gain full control over the northern bank of the Seversko-Donetsk river and the Serebets river line. To gain control over the Serebriansky forest area is a key component and the main effort that is needed for the Russians to achieve success in this section of the front line. They are unable to gain control over Liman without control over the eastern bank of the Serebets river line in its entirety, following which the Russians can start offensive operations beyond the river line directly towards Liman, and with the northern flank, the Russians will continue offensive operations in that direction as well to cut off the supply lines leading into Liman. Getting control over the northern bank of the Seversko-Donetsk river along the Serebriansky forest area will also strengthen the Russian offensive capabilities in the direction of Siversk itself. While gaining control over Liman will strengthen the Russian offensive capabilities in the direction of the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line, will also significantly improve the logistical situation for the Russian forces in the northern section of the front line, as the Russians have a rail connection through the Russian border directly towards Liman on the northern flank. If they're able to secure Liman and the Otsk river line, they'll be able to secure this railway connection all the way to Liman, allowing for significant supplies to be directed towards the front line, significantly improving and bolstering the Russian offensive capabilities in the area. To the southwest of Konstantinivka, the Russians continued offensive operations in between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, continued offensive operations northwest of Popovyar and Poltavka, following the Russian capture of both of these towns, about half of Poltavka. This offensive operation here to the east of Volodymyrivka is an attempt by the Russian forces to advance alongside the gap with the river line to the east and the fortifications of the Ukrainians to the west. The Russians have a gap in the Ukrainian defenses they can advance through to gain control over a significant portion in between the two cities. This is to cut off additional supply lines leading into the settlements here in between the two cities, and also to flank the fortifications of the Ukrainians in this section of the front line near Poltavka and Rusynyar, which are holding back the Russian offensive operations so far. Bypassing these fortifications will significantly improve the Russian offensive capabilities in the area, and it will open up the road for offensive operations in the direction of Mykolaiv-Pilya, Stepanivka, and Roshkishne from the western direction. To the southwest, the Russians continued offensive operations in the direction of Pokrovsk, with the main fighting arena being the Shakhtarsky district, which is filled with apartment complex areas. So far, we're not getting a lot of updates from the fighting in this direction due to how complex and active it is. The Ukrainian forces have sent a lot of reinforcements to the city to hold back the sudden Russian offensive, to which the Russians are actively facing off against the Ukrainian positions. The majority of the areas the Russians have captured so far have been unmanned, and the areas around them have been encircled, leading to quick advances by the Russians, while the Shakhtarsk district has been well garrisoned since the beginning, and this makes it very difficult for the Russians to gain control over it due to the advantages the Ukrainians have with the apartment complex areas being under their control, and the difficulties breaching these fortified positions, and the fortifications in between these buildings all support the Ukrainian defense. It being well garrisoned strengthens their defensive capabilities. Therefore, the Russians will have a very difficult time gaining control over it. However, if they do succeed gaining control over the Shakhtarsk district, then the fall of Pokrovsk is only a matter of time, as the Russians will be able to use that as a foothold for further offensive operations deeper into Pokrovsk. If we take a look at Bakhmut to compare, we'll see that the Shakhtarsk district is akin to the Russians gaining control over the citadel area as the first part of the fighting within the city, and that would have completely made the Battle of Bakhmut much easier for the Russians compared to how it was with the entry into the residential area, which took weeks before they could actually establish themselves for further offensive operations deeper into the city. Therefore, we can see that the Russians entering through this area is very difficult, but if they're able to establish themselves and gain control over the Shakhtarsk district, then their advantage will be well worth the effort. In the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians made two advances, gaining control over Zelenia High, the surrounding areas here to the south of Ivanivka, gaining control of the remaining parts of the town following their foothold achieved earlier, the farm area to the west of the town, and some of the fields surrounding the town in the western and southern directions, as well as the area north of Novokhatsk. The Russians are slowly gaining control over the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, where the next target of the Russians is Andrivka Klevtsova, where the Russians are fighting with fortified positions from the eastern direction and can now also flank it from the northern direction. Gaining control over the town will establish the Russian forces ahead of the Vovcha river line, where we see that the well-fortified crossing of the Ukrainians is the next step. The Vovcha river line, the fortified defensive positions, the Kamyanka river line, and then additional fortified defensive positions, which makes it almost impregnable defensive line of the Ukrainians due to the combination of geographical barriers as well as fortifications built in the area. The Russians will still be able to pass through, however, the fighting directly head-on is difficult. Instead, it is more likely the Russians will look to gain control over Novopavlivka, move through Ivanivka, and then bypass fortifications from the northern flank, or completely bypass fortifications by advancing to the south and to the north on a wider flank, where they'll have to pass through the anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth of the Ukrainian positions, but not a lot of trenches and fortifications and natural barriers. Instead, the Russians can gain control over these fortified positions and settlements along the Vovcha river line, establish their own defensive positions, and then redirect their forces to advance along the second line of defense here in the Zaporizhzhia region and the Dnipropetrovsk region, where they'll be flanking them from the south, and they'll have the Vovcha river line to the north, protecting their northern flank, and then advance in between the river line to the north and the fortified positions to the south to gain control over a wide area of the front line and strengthen their offensive capabilities in the direction of the Serebriansky region, where offensive operations can take place west of Velika Novosilka along the first line of defense, combined with advances on the second line of defense, gaining control over both lines of defense from their rear and weak points, completely diminishing the value of these fortifications. We are already seeing the Russians doing this with the capture of Meliivka here along the Dnipropetrovsk region, gaining control over the second town within the Dnipropetrovsk region. West the Russians are pushing across the border area, gaining control over the fortified positions along the second line of defense of the Ukrainians here in the Zaporizhzhia region, and advancing through these fortifications, gain control over the settlements in between the Vovcha river line and the fortified positions. The Russian summer offensive has begun, but it is still the first stage, which is the initial stage, the shaping of the battlefield, where the Russians are putting gaps and holes into the defenses of the Ukrainians, establishing their own logistical hubs for larger scale operations to take place once they have captured cities such as Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, Liman, Konstantinivka, and capturing the fortified positions and flanking the fortified lines of the Ukrainians in the south. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.